I had thought I'd heard the last of Harold the writing dog when he delivered his book Bunnicula to my office some time ago. Much to my surprise, he suddenly appeared again one recent rainy Wednesday afternoon. The dreary weather had made the day useless for anything more than catching up on all those little boring chores one puts off for just such days, and drinking a lot of reheated coffee to cut the constant chill that sneaks in through the cracks in the windows. When I heard scratching at the door, I thought it was probably a stray cat looking for a warm radiator and a saucer of milk. That alone, I reasoned, would provide some relief from the monotony of the day's non-events. You can well imagine my delight when I opened the door and saw Harold standing on the other side of the portal, his hair drenched and hanging from him like an unwrung mop. From his teeth dangled a plastic bag. I asked him in and examined the contents of the bag that he'd dropped at my feet. What I found was the manuscript of Harold's new book, together with this note. My dear colleague, I had not planned to write again. Indeed, after my friend Chester read my first book, he accused me of writing without a literary license. I had settled into my comfortable life as a nice American middle-class dog with my nice American middle-class family when strange events once again engulfed me. Naturally, after all the fur had flown and the dust had settled, I felt compelled to write the story down. What results is the manuscript you now see before you. I do hope you will enjoy it and, as before, find it worthy of your reader's attentions. Your humble servant, Harold X. I convinced Harold to stay long enough for a donut and a bowl of hot chocolate. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone, leaving behind him the pages of his story, which he has chosen to call Howliday Inn. Looking back on it now, I doubt that there was any way I could have imagined what was to lie ahead. After all, I'm not as well read as Chester, and except for the time I'd run away from home as a puppy and spent a fitful night under a neighbor's porch, I really had had very little experience of my own in the outside world. How could I have begun to imagine then what would befall me that fateful week in August? If the memories of that week no longer make my blood run cold, they still have enough of a chilling effect to give me pause. Why, you may wonder, do I wish to stir them up now when I could so easily curl up in front of a nice warm radiator and think of happier times instead? Well, the answer, a simple one really, is just this. Whatever else may be said of that week, it was an adventure, and adventures, no matter how dark or disturbing to recall, are meant to be shared. It began innocently enough on a beautiful summer's day. The kind of day I remember thinking when the universe seems in perfect order and nothing can go wrong. A soft breeze rustled the hairs along my neck. Birds chirped happily in the trees, a butterfly landed on my nose and would have stayed for a while, I think, if I hadn't sneezed him off. The sky was blue, the sun was gold, the grass was green. Such riches cannot be bought for any price, I thought, as I lay stretched out on the front lawn chewing contentedly on one of Mr. Monroe's new running shoes. Without warning, my blissful mood was shattered by the sound of Toby's voice coming from within the house. "Why?" he kept repeating, a bit unpleasantly. His mother answered him in that ever-patient way of hers. "You've asked me several times, Toby, and I keep telling you the same thing. I know you're not happy about it, but we can't take them with us." "But why? Why?" Toby insisted loudly. I noted several butterflies flutter away from our yard defensively. "We've taken Harold and Chester on vacation with us before," he whined. My ears perked up. I was the topic of discussion. "Just to the lake house, Toby, never on a car trip," Mrs. Monroe answered. "There won't be room. Besides, you know Harold gets car sick. You wouldn't want him to be miserable, would you?" "No," Toby agreed sensibly. "I guess you're right." "Darn right she is," I thought. "But I'm going to miss them, Mom," Toby added. Mrs. Monroe's voice softened. "I know you are, Toby. We'll all miss them, but we'll only be gone a week, and then we'll see them again. Think of everything you'll have to tell Harold when you get home." "Yeah, I guess so," Toby said, his voice trailing off in defeat. "Poor kid," I thought. "He's really broken up." Well, I couldn't blame him. I was a lot of fun, after all, and it was natural he'd want to take me along. I mean, who would he play fetch the stick with? Whose tummy would he rub? Suddenly, panic seized me. Who was going to feed us? I dropped my Adidas, moved quickly to the front door, and began scratching on the screen. "Hi, Harold," Toby said as he let me in. He looked at me sadly and put his arms around my neck. "I'm sorry, boy. Mom says we can't take you on vacation this time. I bet you feel real disappointed, huh?" "Who's going to feed me?" I asked with my eyes. "But don't worry. We'll be back in a week. It won't be so long. Still, you feel bad you're not going, don't you? I know." "Who's going to feed me?" I pleaded, with a hint of a whimper. "Oh, and if you're wondering what's going to happen to you while we're away—" "Yes?" I asked, my eyes growing wider. "Oh, don't worry. Mom and Dad had that all figured out. See, Bunnicula's going to stay next door at Professor Micklewhite's house." I glanced over at the windowsill where the rabbit's cage was kept and saw that it had already been removed. I felt myself breaking into a cold sweat. What was going to happen to me? And you and Chester are going to be boarded. Oh, I thought, feeling relieved immediately. That's all right then. Just one little detail troubled me. I didn't have the slightest idea what being boarded meant. I decided to find Chester and ask him about it since Chester knows, or thinks he knows, something about almost everything. When I found him, he was sitting in the backyard staring off into space. Chester, being a cat, is very good at staring off into space. He once explained to me that this was his way of meditating, or, as he liked to put it, getting mellow. At the moment I found him, he looked so mellow I thought there was a good chance of his ripening and rotting right there before my eyes if I didn't shake him out of it quickly. The Monroes are leaving, and they're going to do something to us with boards, I told him. Don't say hello or anything, Chester replied, without moving a muscle. Oh, sorry. Hello, Chester. How's it going? Chester just nodded his head slowly, as if that were supposed to be telling me something. Now, what was that about boards? He asked at last. I'm not sure. They're leaving and they're going to tie us to boards or something. That's all I know. I'm sure that's not all you know, Harold, he said smoothly. It may be all your brain can handle right now, but I'm sure you know at least one or two things more. Now, let's try again. What exactly did you hear? Well, I explained, Toby told me that while the family goes on vacation, you and I are going to be boarded. Boarded? Chester exclaimed, his mellowness suddenly gone with the passing breeze. We're going to be boarded? I can't believe they do this to us. It figures. That's all I can say. It just figures. What figures? I asked. What are they going to do to us? Oh, just lock us up and throw away the key, that's all. Prison, Harold, that's what it boils down to. We're in their way now that they want to go off and have some fun. So out the door we go and into some dank, dark pit where we'll be fed moldy bread and rainwater. If we're lucky. You don't know what these places are like, Harold, but I do. How? I asked. Were you ever boarded? Was I ever boarded? Was I ever boarded? That's what I asked, Chester. Were you ever boarded? I've read Charles Dickens, sport, was his only reply, and he turned his attention to his tail, which he suddenly felt compelled to bathe. A scowl grew on his face, and I thought that if it were possible, dark rain clouds would have formed around his eyebrows. I'll tell you something else, Harold, he muttered. His hysteria had subsided, and he now spoke in a low, serious tone. What's that? You have to keep your eyes open all the time in places like those. You never know what will happen next. What do you mean? I asked. Think about it, he went on. A group of strangers are thrown together by circumstance. Who knows who they are, where they come from, what they're doing there? The one smiling at you across the food dish in the morning could murder you in your sleep at night. Chester, I said, interrupting, I think perhaps your imagination is running away with you. Ha! Chester snorted. Mark my words, Harold. Keep your eyes open and your doors shut. Just remember, they aren't called strangers for nothing. And he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. With everything Chester had said about strangers, it was hard for me at that moment to picture anyone stranger than Chester. But time would certainly bear out his warning. And I have to admit that even then, there was something in the conviction with which he spoke that made me uneasy. So much so that when I saw Mr. Monroe coming in my direction, I was immediately distrustful. And this of a man whose home I had lived in for years and whose running shoes I had been eating but moments before. Hey there, Harold, guess what? You're going away on a little vacation. Aren't you lucky? I smelled a con job and kept my distance. You and Chester are going to stay in a nice animal hotel for a few days. You'll meet some new friends and have a lot of fun. Doesn't that sound terrific? Interesting he doesn't mention the food, I thought. Having no intention of being conned into living on mold and rainwater, I decided to try a tactic I save only for the most dire of circumstances. As pitifully as I knew how, I started to whimper. Aw, poor Harold, Mr. Monroe said quietly, reaching down to pat me on the top of my head. I was sure I had him hooked. I wish we could take you with us, fella, but we can't. Rats. Besides, you'll have a good time at Chateau Bow Wow. Doesn't that sound like a nice place to stay? Now, come on, boy, he said, moving back towards the driveway. Jump up here into the back of the station wagon. Chateau Bow Wow, I thought as I followed him. It doesn't sound so bad. Not the Waldorf Astoria, maybe, but not bad. Still, I wasn't sure I wanted to go anywhere, particularly after everything Chester had just told me. I lifted my head and let out a soft, muted moan. When I dropped my head again, I noticed Chester lying under the car in the shade by the rear tire. He looked at me and shook his head slowly. What a disgusting display, he said, sighing heavily. But what can one expect from a dog, after all? Well, I replied, I'm glad to see that you're so resigned to being dragged off to prison. I'm not resigned, he said calmly, licking a paw. I'm not going. Oh, really? I asked, and just how do you intend to manage that? Before he could answer, Mrs. Monroe came out the front door with Chester's carrier, a large square box with a little window in one end. I always tell Chester that it looks like he's on television when he's inside. He doesn't find that very amusing. In fact, just the sight of his carrier is usually enough to send him into a panic, hissing and hyperventilating up a storm. This time, however, he seemed determined to remain cool. Toby, Mrs. Monroe instructed her youngest son, see if you and Pete can find Chester, will you? Pete appeared at the door behind Toby. Excuse me, Chester said to me, it's time for my exit. And so saying, he made a mad dash for the nearest lilac bush. Unfortunately for him, Toby and Pete were on to his favorite hiding places. And Pete, who had taken up jogging with his dad, was fast on Chester's heels. Grabbing him by the tail, not the best place to grab anyone, let alone a cat, Pete yanked him back into his arms before Chester could do much more than let out a yelp of disapproval. Pete then attempted to force Chester into the waiting carrier, but Chester spread out all four of his legs so that his paws tightly clamped the edges of the box. With his legs held rigidly in place, he screamed and he hissed, and he generally let it be known in no uncertain terms that he had no intention of going anywhere. All, however, was to no avail, for he was quickly surrounded by the entire Monroe family, and before he knew what had happened, he was squashed into the carrier and plopped into the car. I, on the other hand, went with quiet dignity, allowing myself to be lured into the back of the station wagon by a chocolate cupcake and Mr. Monroe's calm affirmation that adventure was good for the soul. Chester and I had a few moments alone before the rest of the family joined us. Licking the last traces of chocolate frosting from the tip of my nose, I turned to the beast growling inside the cat carrier. I was intrigued by Mr. Monroe's statement about the effect of adventure on the soul, and thought perhaps I could pass the time engaging Chester in deep philosophical conversation. Well, Chester, I began, what do you think? I think you made a fool of yourself over that cupcake, he said. Then again I thought perhaps not. I decided to try another tack. You know, Chester, I said, trying to sound cheerful, maybe there's nothing for us to worry about. The way Mr. Monroe tells it, Chateau Bow Wow sounds like a really nice place. Chester, who had been grumbling under his breath all this time, was suddenly silent. What did you say? He asked after a moment. I said Chateau Bow Wow sounds like a really nice place. Chateau Bow Wow? Yes, Chateau Bow Wow. Chester's face appeared in the window. His eyes were gleaming. What's the problem? I asked. Oh, there's no problem, Harold. No problem at all. Just because I'm being forced to spend a week of my life in a place obviously run by dog chauvinists who are totally insensitive to my feline feelings. Why should that bother me? No, I don't have a problem, Harold. It's the rest of the world who had the problems. Gee, you know, Chester, I said to him, you look just like a guest on a talk show. Harold, have you heard one word I've said? Chester, could you pretend you're on a talk show? You know, just say something like, gee, it's swell to be here today, Merv, or, well, you know, Mike, it's funny you should ask about that. Okay, Chester? Huh? Sing feelings, okay? Chester? Chester? Chester glared at me and dropped out of sight. I heard him muttering something about dogs, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I stopped trying after the Monroes had gotten into the car, and I noticed we were pulling out of the driveway. There was a rumble of thunder in the distance as the car went over a bump and my stomach lurched. Why, I asked myself, had I eaten that chocolate cupcake? I closed my eyes and gritted my teeth. Toby and Pete were fighting about who had the best window. Mrs. Monroe was trying to quiet them down and at the same time pointing out to Mr. Monroe that he had just taken a wrong turn. Chester, meanwhile, was grumbling and hissing inside his carrier. Mark my words, Harold, I heard him say at one point. There's trouble ahead, and don't say I didn't warn you. As I was thinking back on the feelings of peace and contentment with which I'd started the day, Mr. Monroe turned up the volume on the radio. So the outlook for the rest of the week, the announcer was saying, is heavy rain and thunderstorms. Everyone groaned. The car hit another bump, and my stomach began to feel like a washing machine on the spin cycle. This adventure, I thought, may be terrific for my soul, but it's going to wreak havoc on my digestive system.